The pen felt wrong in my hand from the very first second I touched it. I sat at the head of a long conference table surrounded by lawyers I had never met, inside a building I had paid for with 28 years of hard work. The room smelled like fresh coffee and new carpet. Everything looked clean and professional, like a place where fair things happened. Nothing fair was happening here. Craig sat directly across from me. He wore a dark blue suit and a relaxed smile, the kind a person wears when they already know the ending of a story. My wife, Diane, was 2 seats to his left. She had not looked in my direction since we entered the room. Her hands sat folded neatly in her lap, still and deliberate. Her mother, Beverly, perched at the far end of the table. Checking her phone like this was a dentist appointment she could not wait to finish. Craig pushed the final document across the table toward me. "Just formalizing your exit, Harold. Sign at the bottom." I looked down. I read the numbers slowly, carefully, the way I had always read every contract in my life. $0. My shares, my accounts, my retirement fund, all of it transferred. Every single dollar. Gone. My chest tightened like a fist closing. "This isn't right," I said. He slid another page on top of the first. "It is now." I signed. My hand didn't shake, but something deep inside me was already cracking open. I set the pen down and pushed back from the table. My legs felt heavy as I stood. I told myself I needed air. Just a few minutes outside to let my head clear before I said something I could not take back. Then the laughter started. Came from Beverly first. Not a polite laugh or a nervous one. A real, open laugh, the kind you release when you feel completely safe and untouchable. Craig smiled alongside her. Diane still said nothing, but she did not look uncomfortable either. She looked like someone who had expected this moment and had made her peace with it long before today. Beverly looked across at Craig and spoke loudly enough that the lawyers could hear every word. "We told you he wasn't sharp anymore. Took him long enough." Something broke inside me when she said that. Not loudly, not with any drama. It was a quiet break, deep and clean, like a bone fracturing under slow pressure. I felt it move through my whole chest, but I did not raise my voice. I did not flip the table or demand answers. That would have given them exactly what they wanted. Proof that Harold Bennett had finally lost his grip. "I need some air," I said. Craig shrugged without looking up. "Take all the time you need. It's not like you own anything anymore." I walked out. The door clicked shut behind me, and in the silence of the hallway, one single thought rose above everything else, cold and perfectly clear. They had planned every step of this. Long before today. My name is Harold Bennett. I am 58 years old. I grew up in a small house in rural Ohio with a father who repaired diesel engines for other people and a mother who worked the night shift at a laundry to make sure the mortgage got paid every month. We never had much, but we had one thing that turned out to be worth more than any inheritance. We had the understanding that if you worked honestly, kept your word, and paid attention to the details, eventually the work would return something worth having. I carried that into everything I ever built. Bennett Logistics began in a gravel lot behind my father's old workshop when I was 30 years old. I had a single-use truck, a bank loan that made my stomach turn every morning, and 2 employees who believed in what we were doing before I had any real proof they were right to. I drove the first routes myself. Long days, early mornings, winters that broke down equipment and tested patience. I said yes to every contract I could handle and no to the ones I couldn't. I grew slowly and carefully because I knew what it felt like to have nothing, and I never wanted to go back. By my mid-50s, Bennett Logistics had 62 trucks, contracts across 4 states, and over 300 employees who depended on the company to feed their families. Then I made one mistake that cost me everything I had built. I let family into the business, and I forgot to check whether they wanted the business or just what was inside it. I did not leave the building right away. I stood outside the conference room for a few minutes, breathing the cool air coming through the open window at the end of the hall. Then something pulled me back inside. Not hope. I had no hope left by then. It was instinct. The need to see my office one final time before I accepted that it was no longer mine. I walked up to the third floor and turned down the corridor toward the corner office I had occupied for over 2 decades. The wide window, the solid desk, the familiar creak of the third floorboard near the door. I had made my biggest decisions in that room. Signed my most important contracts. Hired the people who built the company alongside me. The door was already locked. A new keypad had been installed on the frame. My old code did not work. I stood at the glass panel beside the door and looked in. Craig was already at my desk. His feet were crossed on top of it, one hand holding his phone to his ear, laughing softly at whatever someone on the other end was saying. He looked completely at home. Not like a man who had just taken something that belonged to someone else. Like a man who had finally arrived somewhere he always deserved to be. He glanced up and saw me through the glass. He did not wave or look away. He simply tilted his head slightly, like I was a mildly interesting stranger, then looked back at his phone. But in that brief moment, I noticed something. He shifted the laptop screen away from the door, quickly like a reflex. Like someone who had almost forgotten to close a window they did not want anyone else to see. I filed that away and walked back downstairs. I drove home on autopilot. My hands moved the wheel and my eyes watched the road, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Kept returning to one thing. A single number buried on page 7 of the agreement. The buyout documents had listed Bennett Logistics at a total value of $12 million. That was the figure Craig's lawyers had used to calculate the terms of my forced exit. 12 million. On paper, it looked reasonable enough that a tired, stunned man might not question it too hard. But I was not a tired, stunned man. Not yet, anyway. I had reviewed the company's books every single quarter for 28 years. I knew every asset, every contract value, every property on the books. Our truck fleet alone was worth over $8 million. Add the warehouse properties, the active contracts, and the long-term client relationships, we were comfortably above $30 million in real value. So where had the other $18 million gone? I sat in my driveway for a long time after I pulled in. I went inside, spread the documents out on the kitchen table, and started going through them page by page. I circled numbers. I drew connecting lines between figures that did not match. I wrote questions in the margin that I had no answers for yet. I was not an accountant, but I had run a real business for nearly 3 decades. And I knew, with the same certainty I knew my own name, that someone had deliberately shrunk this company on paper. The question was why. And more importantly, where the difference had actually gone. In the weeks that followed, I played the role they had written for me. I moved out of the family home without argument. I rented a small apartment on the edge of town. Plain walls, basic furniture, nothing comfortable or familiar. I sold my car and paid cash for an old sedan with high mileage and a noisy heater. I stopped returning most calls. I stayed quiet on every front. Word got around the way it always does in a small business community. Harold Bennett had finally cracked. Lost the plot. Signed everything away and retreated. Craig and Beverly were spotted at industry dinners, shaking hands and accepting congratulations on the new direction. Someone told me Beverly had already started redecorating the executive floor. Let them celebrate. Let them believe the story was over. Every night, I sat at my kitchen table under the pale light of a single overhead lamp and rebuilt the deal from the very beginning. Line by line, number by number, I mapped out every board meeting I had slowly been excluded from over the previous 2 years. I charted decisions I had approved without being given the full picture. I wrote everything down in a plain red notebook that I kept in the inside pocket of my coat. And the more I mapped, the more clearly the shape of what they had done revealed itself. This was not a rushed plan. It was patient, methodical, and designed to survive questions. But in trying to be too smart, they had made one mistake. They had left a clause in the agreement that they clearly did not expect me to find, and when I found it, everything changed. I read it for the first time at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I had been working through the agreement for the 3rd time, slower than before, stopping at every paragraph no matter how routine it looked. The clause was buried between 2 sections about standard liability waivers. It was written in dense legal language, the kind designed to make your eyes slide right past without stopping. I stopped. I read it once, then again, then a third time, word by word, out loud to the empty room. In the event that undisclosed financial irregularities are identified within 36 months of the execution of this agreement, any party whose assets were affected by said irregularities retains full legal standing to challenge the terms of the agreement. 36 months. 3 full years. If I could find documented proof, not suspicion, not instinct, but real proof, that the books had been manipulated and the deal built on false numbers, I had the legal right to challenge the entire transaction in court. Every share, every account, every transferred dollar. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Craig's legal team had drafted that agreement. They had been so careful in 100 other ways. But they had either missed this clause or decided I would never be sharp enough to use it. That was their first real mistake. I was no longer hunting for an explanation. I was hunting for evidence. The specific, documented, undeniable kind that no lawyer in the world could explain away. The next morning, I called Martin Reyes. Martin had served as Bennett Logistics' head auditor for 14 years. He was careful and quiet, the kind of professional who cared more about accuracy than about being liked. We had spoken every quarter for over a decade, sometimes just to check figures, sometimes to work through a problem together. I trusted him the way you trust someone who has proven themselves through years of small, consistent honesty. He picked up on the third ring. The moment I said my name, his voice changed. It became controlled and careful, like someone choosing every word before releasing it. Harold, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I know, I said. I'll be quick. I only need one honest answer from you. A pause. I was told not to speak with you, not about anything connected to the company. I let that sit for a second. Who told you that? He did not answer. But the fact that he didn't was an answer all by itself. Martin, I said quietly, just one question. Were the books clean when you last reviewed them? The silence that followed was the longest and heaviest 3 seconds I can remember. I could hear him breathing. I could almost feel him deciding. Then, so softly I nearly missed it. No. The line went dead. I put my phone down on the table and sat perfectly still. That one word had confirmed everything. The books had been altered. The valuation was a lie. And my name was threaded through every single page of the fraud. I sat with Martin's answer for a long time before I let myself think through what it fully meant. It was not just betrayal. Betrayal would have been painful but simple. What Craig and Beverly had done was far more calculated than simply pushing me out of my own company. Over the previous 2 years, while slowly cutting me out of meetings and decisions, they had been using my name and my credentials to authorize transactions I had never personally reviewed. My login details, my digital signature, my position as founder and majority shareholder. All of it had been used to move money through accounts and approve transfers that I never saw or agreed to. If investigators ever looked at the records, and with amounts this large, those records would point directly at me. I was the founder. My name was on everything. I had been pushed out just weeks before the questions were scheduled to begin. I was not just the person they had stolen from. I was the person they had built to take the blame when it all fell apart. The weight of that understanding pressed down on me until I had to stand up and walk slowly around my small apartment just to breathe properly. I thought about what prison looked like for a 58-year-old man who had spent his entire life playing by the rules. Then I stopped walking. I went back to the table. I opened my red notebook to a fresh page. Anger would not help me. Fear would not help me. Only one thing would help me now. Building a case so clean and so complete that no one in that investigation could look anywhere but directly at the people who had actually done this. I made the decision that night. The real one. The one that changed everything. I was not going to confront Craig. I was not going to call a lawyer and start making noise. I was not going to post anything online or tip off a journalist or fire off letters full of accusations I could not yet prove. Every one of those moves would have given them warning. And a warned person with money and lawyers can do an enormous amount of damage before a case is ever built. I was going to think. Carefully, quietly, and with complete patience. I wrote 3 words at the top of a fresh page in my notebook. Proof. Pattern. Paper trail. Instead, I was going to do the one thing they had decided I was no longer capable of. Those were my only goals. Not revenge, not drama, not a moment where I got to say something satisfying while people watched. Just cold, documented, undeniable truth. The kind that does not need me to raise my voice because the facts speak loudly enough on their own. I thought about the way Craig had watched me sign those papers. The certainty in his expression. The ease of it. He had genuinely believed that Harold Bennett was finished. That there was nothing left in the old man worth worrying about. People who believe they have already one stop watching for threats. They get comfortable. They get careless. They spend money too fast and talk too openly and stop checking the details they checked when they still thought they had something to lose. I was going to let them do exactly that. And I was going to document every single thing they did while they were doing it. 3 weeks after I moved into the apartment, Philip Dalton called me directly. Dalton Group was a mid-sized logistics company based out of Columbus. They had been interested in acquiring Bennett Logistics for years, long before Craig arrived, making offers that were always politely declined. I had turned them down once myself. Not because the offer was unfair, but because I was not ready to hand over something I had built with my own hands. Philip Dalton was a direct man. He opened the call simply. "I heard what happened, Harold. I'm sorry. I wanted to reach out personally." "I appreciate that," I said. "I also want to be straightforward with you," he continued. "We're still interested in the Bennett operation. But some of what we're now hearing about the current management is raising serious flags for us. We'd like to sit down and talk." I told him I needed a couple of days to think it over. But I already knew what my answer was going to be. Philip Dalton had every reason to want the truth about Bennett Logistics to surface. If Craig had manipulated the company's valuation, Dalton Group had been given false information during their earlier evaluation as a potential buyer. They had a legitimate financial stake in finding out whether the books were real. They were not just a business contact. They were a motivated, well-resourced partner who needed the same truth I needed. I called Philip back the following morning. "Let's meet," I said. We sat across from each other at a quiet restaurant north of Columbus. Philip was a steady, no-nonsense man in his mid-50s with a firm handshake and the patient expression of someone who had been in business long enough to know that the first version of any story is rarely the complete one. We spoke for close to 2 hours. I did not show him everything I had. That was important. When you are building leverage, you give a new ally enough to make them genuinely concerned, not so much that they no longer need you to complete the picture. I told him the valuation used in my buyout did not come close to matching the real asset base of the company I had built over 28 years. I told him the books had discrepancies that were now being actively buried by the current management. I told him that if Dalton Group had any plans involving the existing leadership at Bennett Logistics, they needed a serious independent audit before moving a single dollar forward. Philip listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What kind of discrepancies?" he asked. "The kind that tend to become federal investigations," I said. He nodded slowly, the way a person does when something they half suspected is being confirmed rather than introduced. "What do you need from us?" he said. "Access," I said. "And patience." He reached across the table. We shook hands. I had my ally, one with genuine legal standing, real financial resources, and a very strong personal reason to want the truth uncovered. Philip moved quickly once the decision was made. Dalton Group's legal team submitted a formal due diligence request, completely standard procedure for any serious company evaluating an acquisition. That filing immediately triggered an internal audit of Bennett Logistics. Craig had no real choice but to allow it. Refusing a legitimate audit from a credible buyer would have raised far more suspicion than cooperating. I kept my distance and observed through careful channels. I was no longer inside the company, but I still had people there who answered my calls. Former colleagues who had worked alongside me for years and who noticed, without fully understanding why, that the atmosphere had shifted uncomfortably since the new management arrived. One of them, Paul, a longtime accounts manager who had been with me for over a decade, sent me a short message one afternoon. "They're nervous in there, Harold. Something is happening." I thanked him and asked nothing more. I did not want to pull honest people into a situation that could put them at risk. Publicly, Craig managed the early days of the audit with practiced confidence. He gave quotes to the local business press about the company's exciting future. He arranged a profile piece for a regional magazine. He projected stability the way people do when they are desperately trying to prevent anyone from looking too closely at the floor beneath them. But behind the performance, money was beginning to move. Quickly. In the urgent, sloppy way of someone who is no longer thinking about tomorrow, only about right now. The first real cracks were forming. Over the weeks that followed, I watched the spending become impossible to ignore. 2 new properties appeared in public records. Both registered under a holding company connected directly to Beverly's name. Together, they were valued at close to $4 million. 2 large homes in expensive neighborhoods on opposite sides of the city. Craig registered 2 luxury vehicles within the same 30-day period. There were filings for a private aircraft lease, listed under the company's name as a business travel expense. Beverly began showing up at charity galas and fundraising events. Her name appeared in the society section of the city paper twice in 1 month. She was photographed at a table full of real estate developers and local politicians, smiling in the way that people smile when they feel they have finally arrived somewhere they always believed they deserved. They were spending fast, far too fast, and what they did not seem to understand, or perhaps simply did not care about, was that fast spending always leaves a trail. Every property purchase is a public record. Every vehicle registration is a document. Every business expense filed under a company name is an entry in a ledger that auditors are now going through line by line. I printed every accessible public record I could locate. I organized them by date and flagged the ones that lined up with specific internal account movements identified in the audit's early findings. The pattern was not subtle once you understood what you were looking for. They were not spending their own money. They never had been. Then Philip's financial analyst uncovered something that reshaped the entire plan. He had been reviewing mortgage records tied to Beverly's 2 new properties. What he found stopped him cold, and when he called Philip, Philip called me within the hour. Neither mansion had been purchased outright. Both were mortgaged, not partially but to their absolute limit. And the loan applications used to secure those mortgages had been approved based on financial statements listing Beverly and Craig as co-owners of assets worth significantly more than their actual value. The figures had been inflated. The same inflated company valuation used to force me out of Bennett Logistics had been used again, this time to borrow millions from 2 separate banks. In plain terms, they had used a fraudulent number to steal the company from me, and then used that same fraudulent number to take out massive loans against properties they had no genuine way to afford. The mansions were not signs of real wealth. They were expensive debt with beautiful wallpaper. The moment anyone could prove the underlying valuation was false, those loans would be called in immediately. And without the stolen company money flowing in to cover the payments, Craig and Beverly would have nothing to pay them with. I called Philip after he walked me through the analyst's findings. If the audit confirms the valuation was manufactured, he said, the loan approvals collapse. Yes, I said. And if someone held that debt before the banks moved, that person controls what comes next, I said quietly. We were both silent for a moment. Neither of us needed to say anything more. Working carefully through Dalton Group's legal structure, I arranged to purchase a small equity position in Bennett Logistics. It was a minor stake on paper, small enough that it would not appear prominently in any routine filing or trigger any automatic reporting requirement. Small enough that Craig's team, busy managing the audit and moving money between accounts, would not think twice about it when they eventually noticed it buried in the shareholder updates. But it was enough. Enough to give me official legal standing inside the company. Enough to qualify me as a named party if litigation became necessary. Enough to give me access to financial documents that the audit team was already entitled to review. Within 2 weeks of the position being confirmed, I was reading internal records I had not seen since the day they changed my office locks. The picture that emerged was thorough and damning. Over an 18-month period, just under $2 million had been pulled from Bennett Logistics operating accounts and filtered through 4 shell companies. All 4 had been registered shortly after Craig joined the board. The transfers had been made in irregular amounts and at irregular intervals, a technique designed to avoid automatic flagging systems. But the most important thing I found was not the transfers themselves. It was who had authorized them. My login credentials, my account access codes, my digital signature applied to approvals I had never personally seen or agreed to. They had not simply stolen from the company. They had used a digital version of me to do it, so that when investigators eventually came looking, every trail led directly back to Harold Bennett. The audit escalated quickly after that. The investigating team's formal preliminary findings landed on Dalton Group's legal desk and confirmed what I had already pieced together from my own records. Missing funds, shell company routing, inflated property valuations submitted to lending banks, digital access logs that did not match the real-world behavior patterns of the person supposedly making the decisions. Craig attempted to contain the story publicly. He released a short, carefully worded statement describing the audit as routine and characterizing the findings as minor bookkeeping issues from the previous management era. He gave a brief interview suggesting that he and Beverly had inherited a company with messy records and were working hard to bring it up to standard. He was pointing directly at me. Again. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. Craig's personal number. I answered on the fourth ring. I said nothing. I simply waited. Harold. His voice was pulled tight, like a cable under too much load. Controlled, but barely. Did you have something to do with this audit? I waited several seconds. The silence between us was thick. Then I said 2 words. Good luck. I ended the call. He tried 4 more times before 9 that evening. I did not answer a single one. I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and my red notebook open, and I wrote down the time and the number of times he had called. When a confident man starts making desperate phone calls, the walls are already closing in. 2 weeks later, federal investigators made contact. I had been expecting it. Philip's legal team had helped me prepare carefully for this exact moment. When the call came and an investigator asked if I could come in for a voluntary interview as a person of interest, my credentials appeared repeatedly in the flagged transaction records. I said yes immediately and arrived the following morning with a clean folder and a full night's sleep. I handed them the agreement with the reversion clause highlighted in yellow. I walked them through the complete audit trail I had assembled over 6 months, the shell company registrations with their dates, the real estate filings, the inflated loan applications, the digital access logs showing the exact times my credentials had been used and from which devices. I gave them Martin Reyes's name and the date of our brief conversation. I handed over printed public records of every major purchase Craig and Beverly had made since the closing table. The lead investigator, a composed woman in her 40s, sat across from me for nearly 3 hours. She asked careful, specific questions and wrote down every answer. When we finished, she gathered her notes and looked at me steadily. "You've been very organized, Mr. Bennett," she said. "I had strong reasons to be," I said. She nodded and stood to leave. At the door, she paused. "Whoever designed this assumed you would not respond. That," I said, "was their biggest mistake." Everything shifted within 48 hours of that meeting. Once investigators had the full documentation in hand, the case moved faster than I had anticipated. Search warrants were filed and approved. Craig and Beverly's personal attorneys began sending urgent messages to Dalton Group's legal team. The regional business press, which had been running approving profiles of the company's bold new leadership for months, went suddenly and completely quiet. Then the first news story appeared. A regional business publication ran a detailed account of an active investigation into potential financial fraud at Bennett Logistics, naming Craig and Beverly as the primary subjects. By the following morning, 2 more outlets had picked it up. By evening, it had reached the local television news. Within 48 hours, it had been shared thousands of times across social platforms by people in the logistics industry and beyond. The story was simple and easy to follow. A company founder had been pushed out through a fraudulent buyout, his identity used to authorize transfers he never approved, his name attached to records he never personally created. Federal investigators were actively tracing the money. I was no longer the broken older man who had signed everything away at a conference table. I was the whistleblower who had spent 6 careful, quiet months building a case that left no room for doubt, no space for explanation, and no exit for the people who had designed it. My phone began ringing with a different kind of call. Former employees, old colleagues, people who had watched what happened and wanted me to know they had never believed the version Craig and Beverly had been selling. The collapse moved with a speed that surprised even me. The federal account freeze hit Craig and Beverly first. One morning, their cards stopped processing. Bank access was suspended pending investigation. The holding companies used to register the two mansions were flagged, and every asset connected to them was frozen while investigators confirmed how the funding had originated. Craig's attempts to quietly move anything were blocked before they could complete. The window for that had already closed. Inside Bennett Logistics, the damage was immediate and severe. 3 major clients issued contract termination notices within the first week of the news breaking. 2 of them reached out to me personally to express regret at having been misled about the company's leadership situation. A fourth, a client I had signed personally 12 years ago, told me he had always done business on the strength of a Harold Bennett handshake and had never felt quite the same confidence in whoever came after. The company's value, inflated on fraudulent paper to justify loans and buyout terms, began collapsing in real terms. Trucks sat idle. Dispatch schedules fell apart. Staff who had given years of honest work faced deep uncertainty about their futures. That part was hard to watch. Those 300 people had done nothing wrong. They had showed up every morning and done their jobs faithfully. Their livelihoods were now caught inside a wreckage that other people had created. More than anything else, it was thinking about them that kept me moving forward with complete focus and zero hesitation. The loan defaults came exactly as Phillips' analyst had predicted. When investigators formally confirmed that the financial statements used to secure Beverly's 2 property mortgages had been built on inflated, fraudulent company valuations, the lending banks had no legal alternative. Both loans contained standard fraud clauses in their terms. Clear, unambiguous language stating that if the underlying financial information was proven false, the bank could demand full repayment immediately. Craig and Beverly could not pay. Every personal account connected to them was frozen under federal order. The shell companies were frozen. The cash that had been flowing in from the stolen company funds had stopped completely. Every financial door they reached for was already locked and sealed. The banks filed for foreclosure on both properties within the same week. Philip and I had been quietly preparing for this moment for several weeks. The legal documents were ready. The financing had been arranged carefully through a private fund established inside Dalton Group's financial structure. Every step had been reviewed twice by 2 separate legal teams. On the morning the banks formally listed both properties as distressed assets available for immediate acquisition, I made 2 calls. The first was to Philip, confirming the funds were ready and in position. The second was to the bank's asset recovery department. By noon, my purchase offer had been submitted in full. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, both offers had been accepted. The debt on those 2 mansions now belonged to me, not as a creditor waiting in line behind others, as the primary holder, the one with the right to collect. I sat in the bank parking lot for about 15 minutes after I signed the final paperwork. It was a clear, cold morning, the kind where the air feels sharp and clean, like the world has been washed overnight and set out to dry. I watched ordinary people move through the bank's glass doors, making deposits, paying bills, going about their honest, unremarkable lives. I had spent 28 years being one of those people, building something real, paying what I owed, keeping every promise I had ever made in person or in writing. And then I had spent 9 months being someone else, the defeated older man in the small apartment, the one people whispered about at industry dinners, the one Craig had dismissed with a shrug and 13 words about not owning anything anymore. But I had never actually been that person. I had only been playing him carefully for a specific purpose. I had needed them to stop watching me so I could work. Now I sat in a parking lot with a document in my jacket pocket confirming that I held the financial claim on both properties purchased with money taken from 28 years of my labor. This was not revenge. Revenge is loud and impulsive and rarely lands cleanly. This was something older and more precise. This was accountability, built from patience and documented evidence and delivered entirely through proper legal channels. I folded the document, put it in my inside pocket, started the car, and drove. I arrived at the larger of the two properties on a Tuesday morning just before 9 o'clock. It was an impressive house. A wide stone front, tall windows, a long driveway lined with trimmed hedges. The kind of property that announced itself before you even reached the door. I had seen it in the public filings, but standing in front of it was different. I thought about the accounts it had been bought with, the dispatchers who came in before dawn, the drivers who handled difficult routes in bad weather without complaint, the office staff who had given the company their years. Their work had paid for these hedges, these windows, this stone. I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. There was a long pause before the door opened. Craig looked like a man who had aged considerably in a short period of time. He was unshaved, wearing a wrinkled shirt, with the specific kind of exhaustion that belongs to someone who has not slept properly in weeks and for whom every unexpected sound has become something to dread. The easy, certain confidence I had watched him carry through every meeting and every signing was completely gone. There was nothing left of it. He looked at me for several seconds without speaking. Then, quietly, "What do you want, Harold?" I reached into my jacket and removed the documents, the formal debt assignment notice, the demand letter, and a clearly laid out foreclosure timeline. I held them out to him steadily. "I'm here to collect," I said. He looked at the papers, then at my face, then at the papers again. His hand was not entirely steady when he reached out and took them. Beverly appeared in the hallway behind Craig while he was still reading the first page. She took one look at his expression and then at me standing at the front door, and I watched something shift in her all at once. The woman who had laughed openly at the closing table. The woman who had told the room I should have paid more attention. The woman who had shown up at charity events wearing jewelry bought with stolen money. She was simply not there anymore. In her place stood someone much smaller. Someone frightened and stripped of every layer of armor she had been wearing. She started talking immediately about misunderstandings, about how things had been taken out of context by investigators who did not understand the full picture, about family and long relationships and the importance of finding a solution that worked for everyone. She said Diane's name. She mentioned their history together. She used words like arrangement and resolution and reasonable path forward in quick succession. I let her talk until she ran out of words. I did not interrupt once. Craig tried a different approach. He proposed numbers, partial repayment, a private settlement, something managed quietly outside the courts. He used the word reasonable repeatedly, each time in a slightly different context, as if one of the variations might finally land somewhere useful. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him look. Not just physically. In every way that actually matters. I waited until both of them had completely finished. Then I said it simply and without any particular emotion in my voice. I don't want a negotiation. The courts will handle everything from here. I thanked them for their time, turned around, and walked back down the front steps toward my car. I did not look back as I walked away. The morning was still cold and bright. Birds moved in slow arcs above the rooftops. My footsteps were steady on the stone driveway, each one deliberate and unhurried. I had no desire to turn around and watch their expressions or hear what they said to each other after the door closed. That moment was not for me. That was theirs to carry. 9 months ago, Craig had slid a document across a conference room table with an easy smile and told me to sign at the bottom. And I had. Not because I accepted what was happening. Not because I was broken or beaten or out of ideas, but because I had seen one wrong number on a page, and I needed time to understand exactly what it meant before I did anything else. He had believed the story ended there. I had known it was only beginning. I reached my car and stood beside it for a moment, looking out across the neighborhood. Quiet houses. Ordinary streets. The kind of morning that does not care at all what has just happened on one particular doorstep. Bennett Logistics would be rebuilt. Not handed to anyone or sold off in pieces. Rebuilt properly, with equity shared among the people who had shown up faithfully every morning for years and deserved far better than what they had been given by people who never earned a single day of what they took. I had built something from nothing once. I would do it again. And this time, there would be no clause anyone could overlook. No number anyone could quietly change. No version of my name used without my full knowledge and my full presence behind it. I started the car and drove into the rest of my life.